Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's great that so many of you came out for our event tonight. My name is Wayne Anthony. I'm on the steering committee of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Manitoba. First, we acknowledge that we are broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The hydroelectricity powering our computers is generated in Treaty 5 territory, and the water that sustains us comes from Treaty 3 territory. As treaty people, we acknowledge the damage of the past and present and commit to working in meaningful partnership with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. This is the second season of, in fact, this is the final conversation of our second season. Together, Molly, Andre, and Karen, and particularly our presenter tonight, Bronwyn Dobchuk-Land. Speaking Up is a series of conversations about a better and a socially just future that's been organized by the CCPA Manitoba. Our intention with this series is to bring together CCPA supporters and others to talk about how we can create such a socially just future. So check out our website at www.policyalternatives.ca, where you can find out about all the kinds of things we do. And if you can, please support us with a donation. CCPA's social justice research, so much depends on the support of people like you. Before we start tonight, we want you to know that we're going to be recording both the presentation and conversation parts of tonight's event. It will be posted on CCPA's YouTube channel later on. And as well, if you're comfortable, we encourage you to keep your camera on for this event. So the structure of tonight's event is fairly simple and straightforward. Bronwyn is going to do a presentation for about 30 minutes or so, something like that. And after that, we'll have about another 30 minutes to have a conversation with Bronwyn. And that part of the evening will be hosted by our executive director, Molly McCracken. So for tonight's conversation, Bronwyn Dobchuk-Land is an assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of Winnipeg and a member of Bar None, a local abolitionist organization. She holds a PhD from City University of New York Graduate Center, and she researches and teaches in the areas of racism, colonialism, criminal justice policy, community safety, and the alternatives to policing. And so before we start tonight, before Bronwyn begins her presentation, we have a little bit of a poll that we would like you all to participate in, just so we can get a sense of where everyone is at in terms of your interactions with the police.
Yeah, so this poll obviously isn't meant to be a scientifically sound or broadly representative poll. I'm just kind of genuinely curious about people's experiences with the police. I thought this might be an avenue to get to know the audience a little bit. This is my only insight into who you are. Otherwise, I'm just speaking into an abyss. So I look forward to your responses. And I've never actually done one of these polls, so I'm just assuming that yeah, the results are going to pop up. So the poll question asks, what kinds of firsthand experiences have you had with the police? Check all that apply. I'm filling out the poll now. I'm working from the assumption that regardless of where you currently stand on the issue of defunding and abolishing the police, that we're all coming to this question and this discussion with kind of a genuine concern for and commitment to building safer communities for everyone. The poll question can be thought of in part as a device to get you thinking about your own relationship to the issue at hand, and to think about the different vantage points from which we come to public debates about policing as a community safety strategy. And, oh, okay, here. So, can everybody, Zoom is so weird. Can everybody see these poll results? Okay, so 33% of people say that my experiences with the police have been mostly positive. 29% say they've been mostly negative. 26% report that the police have helped me in an emergency. 49% of respondents say myself or someone I care about has been arrested or stopped by the police. 31% say myself or someone I care about has been harmed by the police. 1% says I work for the police. Hi, Danny Smythe. No, just kidding. 8% of people have no experiences with the police. 5% have other types of positive experiences, and 15% have other types of negative experiences. So yeah, like I said, this is just kind of to get us thinking about the different vantage points that people come to this question about defunding the police and policing as community safety strategy with. Often decisions to fund police as the primary public safety strategy are made by people who have very little firsthand experience with the police and are operating based on popular assumptions about policing that aren't grounded in evidence or firsthand experience. So part of what I want to do today is map out the strong base of evidence that supports calls to divest from policing in favor of investing in life-affirming public services, so that when we get to the conversation, we can be engaged in kind of collective planning for justice and safety from a shared understanding of what makes communities safe. I also want to highlight the fact that often those people who do have firsthand experience with the police are disqualified from being considered experts because the same people who are most often victims of crime and likely to experience the police in that setting are also the people most likely to be criminalized. This is because the same conditions that put someone at risk of being a victim of violence, for example, lack of secure housing and income, being stuck in abusive relationships, these are some of the same conditions that make people risky in the eyes of the police and the criminal justice system because of their involvement perhaps in proximity to criminalized forms of work like drug selling or behaviors like fighting back against abusers. Or put differently, many of the conditions that make people vulnerable to criminalization are the same conditions that make people vulnerable to victimization. Lack of access to housing, employment, transportation, income, community or health services. So this is by way of kind of introducing the genealogy that I'm drawing from, the intellectual genealogy, the lineage that I'm drawing on for this talk. And I'm gonna keep talking a little bit about this theory, and then I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna introduce myself and I'm gonna give an agenda for the talk. So thinking about this idea that people with firsthand experience with being criminalized are also people who are most likely to be victims of crime. This lines up in Manitoba. So in Manitoba, Indigenous women make up the fastest growing jail population and are most likely to be victims of interpersonal violence. So one of the main takeaways from the inquiry report into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the Red Women Rising report on the downtown east side is that the material consequences of criminalization, like restriction of income, constraining people's movements, surveilling people, stigmatizing people, these work to undermine Indigenous women's efforts to plan for their own safety. It's not a coincidence that the abolitionist tradition that fuels calls for defunding the police owes a lot of its theorizing and practical advancement to Black and Indigenous feminisms. One of the central contentions of the Black feminist abolitionist tradition is that when we invest in criminal justice responses to social problems, we put the most vulnerable members of our society, poor women of color, at more risk of violence, both interpersonal and state violence. And I'll get into talking about what that looks like a little more. I just wanted to highlight from the outset, in terms of this question of positionality or vantage point, that the evidence, much of the evidence that forms the abolitionist body of scholarship, has been developed by people who have been victims of interpersonal violence and or state violence, criminalization, and whose commitments to abolition come from the deeply felt understanding that policing and the criminal justice system it upholds is or are seriously inadequate modes of producing safety, accountability, and justice. So in case there's anyone in the audience who reads calls to defund and abolish the police as people who, as coming from people who don't understand, what violence is really like, or what the streets are really like, it's quite the opposite. When the analyses of criminalized and policed people are centered, as they are in the abolitionist tradition, we can see that police fueling cycles of violence in our communities, not interrupting. There has been so much written about abolition over the past 30 years and defunding the police specifically in the past year. The internet is full of entire toolkits, roadmaps, primers that do a much more comprehensive job of introducing the concept and history of defunding the police than I can really do here. So if you combine those online resources, and I'll drop some links in the chat, with the incredible work that Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg, Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, and Police Free Schools Winnipeg have done to advance the conversation about defunding, to pry open spaces in public discourse for people to share their critiques of the police and to build up our abolitionist imaginations. Those groups have done more in Winnipeg in the last year than I would have ever imagined possible. And I just wanted to say that I'm so indebted to all of that work. I can't really claim to be saying anything new here today. What I'm going to try to do is tie some of the global demands and theory and evidence that supports them to the local Winnipeg context. But what I'm really looking forward to is the conversation part of the night. Okay, so with that in mind, this is the plan for my talk. The promise of the talk was to discuss what it could look like to defund the Winnipeg Police Service and build alternative capacities in its place. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about kind of policing theory 101. What do police do? What don't police do? This includes some myth busting about police work and some current crime and jailing trends for Manitoba. Then I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the current police funding landscape in Winnipeg, the municipal, provincial, and federal sources of police powers and capacities, i.e. our targets for defunding, not defending, and abolishing the police. I have a little section where I talk about why defund and not reform. And this section is geared toward developing literacy around how to spot seemingly progressive reforms that actually expand the powers of police, and a discussion of the importance of political education and struggle over budget. So we are talking about defund as a political strategy and a consciousness raising strategy specifically. And then at the end, as the introduction to our conversation, I want to talk kind of more specifically about how we can defund and abolish the police in Winnipeg. And again, I want to flag that Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg has a petition that, as Owen Taves mentioned in a presentation to the Winnipeg Police Board, more people have signed that petition supporting abolishing the Winnipeg Police Service than people who voted for Brian Bowman in the last election. So that petition provides a roadmap for abolishing the police in Winnipeg. And so I want to kind of center that. And also when we're talking about how we can defund or abolish in Winnipeg, I'll talk a little bit about what abolitionist theory and practice offers us in terms of rethinking violence and resisting some of the more trenchant barriers to abolition, particularly, again, progressivist or leftist narratives. I'm just going to flag that I have a 3-month-old baby and I can already hear her crying, even though I fed her right before the talk. So we might be interrupted by her. in the spirit of situating the kind of scholar activist genealogy I'm drawing on, I'm going to situate myself briefly. I know this seems like a long introduction when a third of the talk is an introduction, but I think the framing is important. Yeah, and here's a baby coming up the stairs. You guys are going to get to meet my baby. Oh, can I put a link to the petition? Yeah, for sure. In the chat. See, Andre asked me to send her links. Here's a link, but I didn't get to it. So my ancestry is Ukrainian and Scottish. My parents grew up in a small town in northern Saskatchewan and on a farm in Gladstone, Manitoba, respectively. I grew up in the Wolseley area of Winnipeg. I attended Gordon Bell High School. I did my PhD, as Wayne mentioned, at the City University of New York Graduate Center, and my dissertation research was about the growth of the carceral state in Manitoba under the NDP. And in this context, I've been particularly interested in studying seemingly progressive reforms that in practice lead to the expansion of criminal justice, so I will dwell on that a bit today. Since moving back to Manitoba in 2015, I've continued to study criminal justice system in Manitoba and across Canada. I've been involved in local abolitionist organizing, and I've been involved with other members of Bar None in delivering alternatives to calling the police workshops, where I have learned a lot from community members about their experiences, desires in relation to community safety. I'm also going to drop some links here that are links to other talks I've done or things I've written. What I'm saying today is a little bit of a mishmash of other things that have been said or published elsewhere. Yeah, I don't know if you guys can hear the screaming babies and toddlers in the background. Everything was so calm until this webinar started. Okay, so what do or don't police do? I'm going to start by addressing some of the myths or assumptions about police work that often propel the sense that we need policing. So the first myth is that police protect us from violence. Evidence suggests that flooding our streets with the police has done virtually nothing to change the conditions that lead to the most prevalent forms of violence. People are far more likely to be victims of interpersonal violence from people that they know in private spaces rather than strangers in public spaces. But we've kind of built a system premised on the idea that it's keeping us safe from random strangers. Sorry. There's a toddler in the background trying to get in. So
take a break, Bronwyn.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
No. I don't need a break. I just need people to, yeah. Okay. So I'm getting a message that nobody else can hear it. So that's great. Okay. So in 2019, for example, police received 17,700 calls for service for domestic events. And that's more than the total number of all crimes recorded in the downtown area in 2019 combined. It's more than the number of crimes, the numbers of instances of assault with a weapon, robberies, break and enters across the city. So the largest category of citizen-generated demands for police response are for domestic incidents. And what we know about domestic violence, and not all domestic events categorized as such are domestic violence, but is that police are very ineffective at preventing it. They don't prevent domestic violence through police patrols, that's for sure. People aren't motivated to not participate in domestic violence because of the threat of policing. We know that domestic violence is much more effectively curbed by funding housing by empowering people with adequate income, support for childcare, flexibility to get out of abusive or unsafe living situations. In terms of other forms of violence, there's no evidence that police prevent other forms of violence either. At best, they respond after the fact. Police are called and sometimes come, but not always, after an event has happened or in the midst of an unfolding crisis. And as we have seen in a number of high-profile events over the last many years, police are often triggers of escalating crises instead of de-escalating them. Another myth is that police spend most of their time responding to emergencies. So again, taking stats from the police report, annual statistical report, 55%, so they only actually spend half their time responding to calls themselves as emergency, 35% classified as urgent, but over half of those calls are classified as non-urgent. So over half of the events police were dispatched to last year were not urgent. This image that we have of police going from call to call, in fact, police work involves a lot more mundane problem solving, finding extra legal solutions to problems that are barely, criminal, and I'll talk about that a little more later. But with these statistics, we can see that even if we still believed that we needed police to respond to those categories that are emergencies, you could still cut the police budget by 50% and redirect to frontline responses that are evidence-based and meet people's needs. So the top 5 events that police were called to are domestic disturbances, well-being checks, suspicious persons, or general disturbance or intoxicated persons. So these are all categories where we can that maybe challenge a bit of our assumption of the kind of high stress situations that we imagine police spending their time responding to. Another myth is that crime statistics, as we see them, are accurate representations of rates of harmful or law-breaking behavior. And this is important because the police use crime statistics in order to paint pictures of what's going on in the city in order to justify funding. So something that you'll learn in Intro to Criminal Justice 101 is that police reported crime statistics are measures of police behavior, not criminal behavior. So for example, in the police reported crime statistics, we see really high rates of break and enters in the Portage Avenue and downtown districts, but not as high in other districts. And supplementing that with qualitative research, it's kind of consistent with anecdotal reporting in poorer neighborhoods where people will report a break and enter and the police won't come, or they've just decided not to report break and enters at all because there's so little confidence in the police. A high prevalence of offenses like disturbing the peace and mischief in downtown Winnipeg reflect stated municipal and provincial priorities to use increased police and security presence to protect downtown businesses and investments. So the offense disturbing the peace skyrocketed in the Portage Avenue district. It was up 225% over the 5-year average in the Portage Avenue downtown district, but 0% in North End Winnipeg. And again, disturbing the peace, mischief, these are very subjective offenses. They reflect decisions on the part of the police to charge someone criminally for being disruptive, which is a condition that in other times and places might be resolved by a community member or service instead of a police officer. Another myth is that police simply administer and enforce the law. A significant amount of police work is finding extra legal remedies to problems of disorder. Their job requires a significant degree of discretion that's not governed by rules or laws or code, or codified in the ways that we might imagine. So discretion outside of the use of force, discretion is a feature that is very protected in the role of police. Their use of discretion is protected by law. So one of the reasons it's so hard to hold a police officer accountable for using excessive force is because they are required to interpret and determine the degree of reasonableness of force. And if the law calls into question their capacity to interpret that, then the entire logic of policing kind of collapses. So structurally speaking, when police make extra-legal informal decisions that involve their own interpretation of a problem, or a decision to let someone off with a warning instead of processing them for a criminal charge, this is not unique or corrupt. This is the core function of policing. So police don't simply administer and enforce written laws. They have a lot of discretion to use power. In that context, another myth is that bias-free policing is possible. One of the major police capacities that exists is patrolling the streets. A whole lot of their work is in noticing things that look to be out of order in public. In this context, in this world we live in, disorderly conduct, disordered people, these are entirely subjective categories. They are defined by what an officer at a given time perceives to be behavior that's out of order. And again, research evidence suggests, and I'm turning to the work of Andrea J. Ritchie here, that people of color, people who don't fit gender norms, young people, people who are doing things in public that are maybe associated with homelessness, all of these people are far more likely to be categorized as disorderly and therefore be subject to police attention or targeted for police attention. So in this context, what's often called racial profiling is actually just part of the core normal functioning of police work in the context of a racially unequal society, a racist society. So police are the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system. Again, they decide whether to let someone off on a warning or process them further into the criminal justice system. And the changing shape of the jail population in Manitoba reflects the increasing emphasis on policing over the past 20 years. So over the past 20 years, we've seen more police power, more police capacities, and Manitoba's jail population has thus been growing faster than other provinces and territories. While total admissions to sentenced custody rose across the provinces and territories by about 20% in the past 15 years, they rose by 133% in Manitoba. And the most significant increases in jail populations in Manitoba over the past 20 years has been women. There's been a 458% increase in women in sentenced custody since 2003-2004. Over 80% of those women are Indigenous. More women are being imprisoned, and at the same time, more women are being imprisoned for shorter periods of time. So the median sentence length for women in Manitoba has dropped from 60 days to 70 days, to 7 days, sorry. The picture I'm painting here with all these statistics is that the character of our jailing system also defies what I think the popular perception is. The vast majority of people who are jailed right now in Manitoba haven't been convicted of an offense. They're waiting for trial, they're on remand. And they are serving extremely short sentences for minor crimes. So there is more time served on remand, more repeated short-term stays in jail. And these kinds of jail fluctuations are often associated with changes in policing. The more police we have on the streets and the more we empower them in strategic directions to pursue people with probation conditions or with bail conditions, the more people will be noticed for their law violations and cycled through in these short sentences. And we know that when someone is removed from their community to jail for any length of time, it's incredibly destabilizing. They might lose their housing, their work, their children. So these are some of the ways that that increased police capacity has affected jailing rates, which has affected kind of the stability of our communities. So what is the current police funding landscape in Winnipeg? So briefly, for those of you who don't know, the most significant chunk of the police budget comes from the municipal government. Police also receive grants from the provincial government. The provincial government also sets priorities, formally, informally, related to the justice system that have implications for the police. So at the provincial level, for example, under the Manitoba NDP, there was a prioritization of the pursuit of bail breaches at the level of Crown prosecutors. There was a prioritization of warrant sweeps. Non-criminal code legislation can be introduced at the provincial level, like the Safer Communities and Neighborhoods Act, which transforms non-criminal behaviors into behaviors that can be subject to surveillance and punishment. At the municipal level, strategic priorities are also set. And these sometimes affect funding. The police board is supposed to be a forum for the public to engage in the setting of police priorities, but it's been more of a cheerleader for the police in practice. So this is just to say that we can fight the police budget both on its distribution of funding in terms of what powers and capacities that funding enables, and we can fight it in terms of the values it conveys in its directing of money to police over community services in the context of the municipal sphere. Okay, so I am cognizant of time. This did not time out the same way when I was practicing it. I am going to get through my other sections, and I'm going to promise to wrap up in 10 minutes. The Winnipeg Police Service budget makes up almost 30% of the city's annual budget. This represents an increase of over 50% over 10 years. In comparison, the operating expenditures of all community services are about a third of that. So community services funded at the municipal level include libraries, pools, rec centers, places where people can go rest, collect themselves, cool off or warm up, use the internet. These are crisis prevention services. And the increasing police budget has come at the expense of those services. Provincially, over the past 20 years, Manitoba's justice budget doubled from 300 million when the NDP came into power to 600 million when the NDP left power, and that's adjusted for inflation. So provincial funding has the capacity to put more police officers on the streets across Manitoba. Jails are built at the provincial level. And when there is space in jail, jails get filled. When there's less space in jail, or when jails become dangerous, I mean, they are always dangerous, but this is a side note, but in the context of COVID, when tasked with reducing the jail population, we can see that Crown prosecutors are capable of doing so. So building jails, putting police officers on the streets, these political decisions at the provincial level taken together help to ensure that people who violate curfews, no contact orders, or substance use conditions, or people who commit low-level offenses are far more likely to be seen by police, arrested, charged, convicted, and jailed. The Pallister government has begun to scale back justice spending. They've reduced the number of operational jail beds and people on remand, but they've done so in the name of austerity, not in the name of investing in meaningful community safety initiatives. And as we will get to right in a minute, defunding police is a political demand that is not an austerity demand. It is one half of a demand to divest from policing and invest in communities. So federal powers are also important when we're talking about what police are empowered to do. The criminal code is determined at the federal level. One way to reduce the need for policing is to decriminalize everything. Decriminalize drug using and selling, decriminalize buying and selling sex, decriminalize homelessness. One of the problems with policing is this category of crime that is codified in the criminal code, but also in our imaginations. Police are tasked with responding to crime, which is this catch-all category that includes such a wide range of problems that require, in reality, such vastly different solutions. But as we've chipped away at funding and support for those other solutions, we've been left with the police being the most likely responders because they are the capacity that we continue to enable and embolden with our funding. So we hear a lot about commitments to reducing overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in our justice system. And I want to highlight that the unequal outcomes produced by our justice system, like the over-policing and imprisonment of Black and Indigenous people, are much less explicable via the question of who commits crime and why, and much more directly tied to political decisions about the distribution of public resources and strategic decisions within the criminal justice system that shape who the justice system targets. The justice system is not well equipped to target mass polluters, unsafe workplaces, faulty and deadly products. The criminal code isn't a reflection of the amount of harm or violence or life-shortening conditions in our society. Rather, the criminal code, the criminal justice system, individualizes structural harmful behavior and punishes it at the individual level. So because we have funded, we've created through these political decisions all these opportunities for the police and the criminal justice system to respond to problems instead of furnishing other responses, or instead of furnishing people with the resources and support needed to solve their own problems in ways that make sense to them before they escalate into crises that come to the attention of police. Why defund and not reform? The most effective and evidence-based way of making sure people who are already poor, oppressed, and subject to heightened public scrutiny and surveillance, the most effective way to make sure they're not met with punishment and instead are met with support is to reduce policing, reduce the powers of police, reduce the capacities of the police, reduce the places police are able to have access to, and the scenarios they're responsible for responding to. So in that context, it doesn't make sense to try to change or reform policing. It makes sense to redirect money away from policing. And the defund movement is based in this understanding that budgets are political and moral documents, and that struggling over spending priorities is actually a struggle over public declarations of whose lives matter. So engagement with budgetary decision making has been a central strategy of the abolitionist movement. Californians United for a Responsible Budget, the Freedom to Thrive report. These are a couple of the kind of central budgetary engagement experiments that have undergirded or that have preceded calls to defund police in the most recent round, in the past year. The Freedom to Thrive report, for example, describes the arc of municipal and county budget processes, how revenue is raised, what's included in local budgets. It does a lot of budgetary popular education in order to build collective literacy. So budget documents are used as popular education tools to build coalitions and to gather support for articulating priorities other than those that are reflected in budgets that continue, in this case, to fund police. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a document. Oh, so somebody in the chat asked a question, but we'll get to it in the questions. The answer to your question, Marlene, about police data is that you can find all of that in the annual statistical report of the Winnipeg Police Service, and you can find that really easily online, and I can link to it during our conversation. So I had a little bit of stuff written here about avoiding reforms that actually expand police budgets in favor of reforms that shrink police budgets. So the link that I just put in the chat is kind of a chart that outlines some of the reform traps that that communities have fallen into in trying to address criticisms of the police. Community policing is often posed as a solution to problems in policing, but in practice ends up being a route through which police can kind of make themselves look good and continue with the intelligence gathering that they need in order to continue to criminalize. The current 211 pilot project in Manitoba, the diversion of calls from policing to social services. This is great if it means we're redirecting resources, but the Winnipeg Police Service has conceded in the context of this initiative. This is an initiative where they've partnered with the United Way to reduce calls for service that go to the police and try to divert other types of responses to those calls. Great. However, the police have used this concession that we can't police our way out of social problems to emphasize that diverting calls will free them up to do more real police work. So in that case, when the police are saying we can't police our way out of a problem, but still managing to collect public resources in order to do other types of police work, that's a red flag. Diversity training, body cameras, these are other popular reforms that sound nice, but grant the police even more money and allow them to renovate their image again, allow them to maintain their control over the definition of community problems. I'm gonna get to the part about abolishing the police in Winnipeg now. So Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg led protests last summer with the chant, defund the police, refund the community. Both refund as in we, the public, want a refund for this massive expenditure that hasn't really added value to our lives, and also refund the community as in restore funding to those elements of community spending that have suffered even as the police budget has increased. So I did drop the link to that petition in the chat. People should look at it. The vast majority, so how do we abolish the police in Winnipeg? How do we defund them? The vast majority of the police budget is spent on salaries. There are hundreds of police officers eligible for retirement. Don't replace them is one first step. Further cut positions. Take powers away from the police to respond to wellness checks, domestic violence interventions, drug using and selling, sex work, policing behaviors associated with being homeless. While the legality of those things is debated at the federal level, there are models of municipal strategic decision-making that have attempted to call the police off of policing things like adult consensual sex work in Vancouver, for example. On smaller scales, we can fight to keep police out of schools and out of community centers in order to create spaces and opportunities for people to get support and public services without the threat of being treated like suspects. One of the major downfalls of community policing is that when social services partner with the police, those spaces, the social service spaces, become less safe for people for whom police are a threat, so people likely to be criminalized. In the context of the nonprofit world that is so vast in Winnipeg, something we need from community spaces is a clear articulation of how institutions are going to respond if people seek help in those spaces. So institutions need to be straight up about how they're partnering with the police. And this likely involves planning processes within those institutions to have conversations about how they're going to relate to the police in their spaces. There are a lot of elements of the nonprofit world that act as barriers to keeping police out of their spaces. For example, the more that nonprofits are staffed by professionalized social workers, the more there are these like legal liability structures that make it hard for an organization to decide that they're not going to call the police on their participants. Let's see. In the context of the alternatives to calling the police workshops that I've been involved in developing and delivering, at the individual level, we work through scenarios that people bring where they have thought about calling the police, have called the police, wish they hadn't called the police, and we go through a checklist as such. What would a resolution to this situation look like? Answering this question often highlights how little the police are actually able to do to resolve any of the situations that people often turn to them for. When we brainstorm ideas or successful strategies for responding without the police, we ask of the potential responses, does this response harm anyone? Is this a response that might put people in further danger? In many cases, calling the police puts people in danger of criminalization. For many different reasons. Calling an ambulance might actually result in police attention. What would you need to carry out this alternative response, and from who? So acknowledging that developing alternatives to the police in order to reduce our reliance on them isn't always going to be able to happen at the individual level. In fact, it requires that other systems be activated and also resist partnerships with the police, decoupling healthcare provision from policing, eliminating the mandatory reporting of bullet wounds, for example, acknowledging all of these different questions, like what do we need from neighbors, institutions, loved ones in order to respond to a crisis situation without the police. These are the beginnings of steps we can take to generate lists of spaces we need to create, capacities we need to build, resources we need to demand in order to bring actual alternatives into being and to build up our sense of collective responsibility for bringing those alternatives into being. Okay, so thank you everyone for listening. Boy, I really wish I could see all your faces. This was a reminder that I haven't been teaching for a few months and I am not on top of my time management skills. So thank you for bearing with me. There's a lot more that needs to be said and that I could say, so I hope that we get some questions. But thanks a lot, everyone, for listening, and thanks to the CCPA for having me.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn Dobchuk-Land, for your talk. So much information, a lot of important food for thought there. And I particularly want to note giving a talk with a 3-year-old and a toddler in the next room during a global pandemic is...
they sound like they're dying. I know they're not, but...
we can't hear them at all. So we're hanging in there, and important issue. We really wanted to cover it in this series and learn from you. So yeah, I have a question to kick off, and we are having some questions coming in from everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We have over 100 people here on a beautiful spring evening. So we really appreciate you all being here with us tonight. And there is a Q&A box. So we're asking if you could please put your questions in the Q&A section. separate from the chat, that would be great. So we'll do that. Yeah, and I guess my question's kind of a philosophical one. I just watched and learned so much during, the movement, Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd reaction to his murder, going to the legislature here, seeing the most people I've ever seen here, and it was during COVID too. And yeah, there's just so much to unpack. And I think as somebody who, has come to this in various fits and starts over my life, I always find it, it's challenging because police are kind of pervasive in our popular culture. I remember when they came to my classroom when I was a child, I was taught certain things about that, but I also have had negative or witnessed negative interactions as well, running the gamut, and I'm a privileged settler white woman. So yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk, or if what your thoughts are on this emotional reaction people have so easily, that I think perhaps fuels centrists or moderates to go even harder on a tough on crime agenda than perhaps more right-wing respondents. And the critical moment we're at now, where people are finally challenging that in a big way and unpacking it. Where do you think we're at right now? And I guess, how can we take it further?
Well, I think that, so one of the things that I've learned in the context of teaching and doing abolitionist work in the community is that people hold really complex and contradictory ideas about everything, and safety and the police is, one of those things. And that almost everyone has a personal experience with a loved one who has gone through some kind of crisis, be that related to mental health or addictions or domestic violence or other forms of interpersonal violence or a random crime. A lot of people have these types of experiences. And a lot of people have experienced a little kind of helplessness in relation to dealing with those issues. A lot of people who have experiences with the police have experienced being really let down by what the police response has to offer. And these are all very emotional things. And I think that those experiences exist. People don't necessarily articulate those experiences in terms of criticisms of the police, but a global movement to defund the police and work on the part of activists and organizers to put defunding or abolition on the table actually literally opens up space for people to reprocess, reinterpret, understand, develop consciousness around those complex and contradictory experiences. So I think part of what's happening is that that space has been opened up. People who were previously silenced by taken for granted understandings of what the police and prison systems do, now actually see spaces for themselves to, first of all, for their experiences to be reflected, and for themselves to share their experiences, which then, of course, snowballs. Yeah. And as for progressives and like those who know me will know that that's kind of my primary preoccupation, is with this question of how people who understand themselves to be progressive end up overseeing, ushering in, or consenting to massive expansions of policing and imprisonment, such as what happened under the NDP in Manitoba. That has a lot of parts to it, but one of the parts is a pervasive liberal form of racism, not a conservative form of racism, where people who are subject to criminalization are also subject to social work interventions, which share the fundamental premise that people in power don't believe that poor people of color can be experts in their own experiences can adequately be trusted with making their own safety plans. Yeah, like what happened under the NDP was this idea of tough on crime and tough on causes of crime, which comes from Tony Blair and the Labour Party. But this idea that we can pair social work with police responses in order to have a holistic response, when really the evidence suggests that when we pair policing with anything, police logic overrides that other logic. And also the underlying logic is still that people's lives need to be intervened in rather than people need to be given the capacities to solve their problems in ways of their own choosing before they reach crisis situations.
Great, thank you. We have lots of questions. Thanks everyone for adding your questions. So yeah, this question, there's no name with it. I'll read it out to you, Bronwyn. Such a big part of breaking up with the cops in our streets and our minds is recognizing there is no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing them. This is a good dovetail of what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what practical steps and ways of thinking we can engage in to reskill ourselves, our communities, and our relationships to deal with conflicts and harms when they arise.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And that's what I linked earlier to the alternatives to calling the police in the links from Bronwyn. Yeah, alternatives to calling the police workshop facilitation guide. And that's what I was getting at with the kind of guiding questions that need to be collectively engaged with and don't have particular answers, that break down and disaggregate all these different types of problems that end up being categorized as crime. The responses that we need in order to respond to somebody who is having a psychotic break are different than the responses that we need for somebody who is, abusing their partner. And fundamentally, the people who, and the responses in all of those situations are not the same for every person, right? Fundamentally, for every situation to which the police are called, there is very often a loved one, a family member, a community member, somebody who has a relationship to the person who's being subject to policing in that moment, to a police response in that moment. There's somebody who probably could have seen that moment coming and has probably tried in many ways to prevent that moment from happening by trying to access resources that don't exist. So the people who are suffering from these crises, or their loved ones are, that are most often criminalized, are the best sources of information about how these situations could be resolved so that they don't escalate into situations that require police response. Okay, the baby's coming in now.
Oh, great.
You can bring her in.
Entrance.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, right before COVID hit, there was the city budget, and the police were calling for bigger increases. This conversation was happening, and at the same time, community services and community organizations grants was a 10% cut on the table. And, at that time, a number of people spoke out. Community groups wrote letters. And, one of the community leaders at the time said, these are community-based organizations that are on the ground. They have relationships. They're supporting people. They're, supporting people to get access to these resources. And yet this 10% cut to the community grants still went ahead. So that is just so... right here in Winnipeg just last year. So yeah, we're dealing with this all the time. Hello, hi.
It's bedtime. What a time for a talk.
We have a couple more questions if you like, and yeah, just let us know how much longer you've got.
Oh yeah, we can keep going.
Okay.
As long as you don't mind seeing my kids.
Yeah, hi. It's Sylvia. Hello. This is a question from Helmut Harry Lowen.
Yes, hi. Hi, Harry.
He said, abolitionist projects face pushback not only from police associations, I hesitate to use the word police union in this context, but also from jail and prison guards who are organized in public sector unions. The NDP is unlikely to get on board with abolitionist projects, given in part the influence of unions representing workers in the carceral system. We can discuss the hurdles confronting abolitionist proposals and what alternatives there are, because we've had this conversation about also respecting collective agreements.
Yeah, so I'd say that the idea, like seeing police as workers in the context of capitalism rather than guardians of capital, is a huge barrier to abolitionist struggles. The purpose of unions is to be able to organize workers to collectively intervene in the capitalist profit motive, to upset it, to undermine it, because that is the fundamental power that workers have in the context of capitalism. Police very directly protect capital, right? They protect private property. The ways that they are practically organized, even if not in theory, is to emphasize policing business improvement districts, making people feel safe to be able to consume, making property safe to be able to develop property values. So seeing police as workers, and therefore, treating their collective agreements as something that should get in the way of demands to reduce public spending, I think is really misguided. But another thing that happens that we've seen is that unions, as representatives of a working class that imagines criminalized people as outside of the working class. So other unions, other public sector unions, imagining criminalized people as threats to workers instead of unemployed members of the working class, which ends up posing worker security and safety in opposition to the well-being of people subject to criminalization. So for example, the Amalgamated Transit Union, which, argued for police on buses instead of free bus fare, or the MGEU, which argued for correctional officer safety as being contingent on imprisonment instead of freedom for people who are subject to jailing. The UFCW, which argued for increased security and policing at grocery stores instead of access to food. QP 500, that argued for increased security at libraries to protect from people in crisis instead of increased access to safe places. There are all sorts of ways that public sector unions could choose to wield their power in solidarity with criminalized people. But I think, again, often because of racism, they don't. And so I think that's a real challenge to, public sector unions and the NDP.
Yeah, I'll just keep going here with the question here. This is from Andrew. Given that the Pallister government is seeking to remove municipal authority over police budgeting altogether, even as Mayor Bowman critiqued, what are the horizons for the project of defunding policing in a climate of increasing centralization and provincial control?
Yeah, well, okay, so I don't know if I'm understanding the question right or responding to it directly. But I do think that, like, what that question reminds me of is demands for democratic control over policing and more accountability structures as being one of these reforms that are often kind of don't actually get us to where we want to go. Mommy, I'm not comfortable. She's not comfortable. Yeah, I mean, I don't really think increasing centralization. The Pallister government is obviously interested in the idea that more democratic control over the police could somehow improve policing or change the structures of policing hasn't really played out in the accountability structures that we've seen people try to build up over the past decades.
Okay. There's two questions here that are related. One from Mark asking what kind of examples or responses would you suggest for domestic violence?
Mhm.
And then from Aiden, what strategies have worked in other jurisdictions to destabilize law and order and tough on crime mentality?
Okay, so hi, Mark, and thank you for that question. So the best, like, this is also where we kind of get trapped sometimes in the question of police abolition. Ideally, and the question isn't like preventing crime or responding to crime, but ideally we have created a society in which women are not trapped in abusive situations that respond, or people are not trapped in abusive situations that require emergency response. And we also know that in practice, often because the core function of policing is criminalization, people who are in domestic violence emergencies don't call the police because they are acutely aware of how much more devastating the impact of criminalization of their abusive partner would be than the actual abuse. So the system as it's working right now is such that it discourages people from seeking help from the police. But and I'm not an expert in the area of responses to domestic violence. Like, it would be better to, I would consult the work of Beth Ritchie in the United States, who's written a whole amazing book called Arrested Justice about how the feminist anti-violence movement kind of inadvertently dovetailed with the rise of the prison nation in America by calling for increasingly carceral responses to domestic violence in order to take violence seriously, that in the end ended up making poor women of color even more vulnerable to multiple forms of violence. I think I referenced that in the talk. But the solution that's most often highlighted is housing, like access to safe and affordable housing, the ability to move quickly. Access to safe and affordable transportation is also related to that mobility context. Like, these are types of structures that we can build in order to reduce the impact of domestic violence. But yeah, I'm not an expert in that area. Can you remind me of Aiden's question?
Oh, Aiden's question was, what are alternatives to a tough on crime, to calls for tough on crime, or this reactionary fear mongering, I would call it. But
yeah. I mean, I think that one of the most powerful responses is that it doesn't work, like we've been spending so much money on policing and imprisonment. It hasn't made a dent in crime rates, and it certainly hasn't made a difference in terms of people's experiences of violent victimization or harm. So I've seen things being thrown around on Twitter like why should we try out abolitionist responses? Well, let's try them, because we've been trying carceral responses for decades, and they haven't really gotten us anywhere. So carceral responses don't work to make people safer. They don't reduce crime. They don't reduce harm. And actually, something that I found in teaching, and I teach in a criminal justice department, and so I teach lots of students who are sometimes already training to be police officers or corrections officers, or that's what they want to do, or they have family members in those professions. They often actually, when given the opportunity, really acutely understand the failures of those systems, because they are also, in a sense, on the front lines of them. You can learn a lot from people working in those systems about how much those systems don't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you so much. We're just going to wrap it up now. You've got your lap full there. So thank you so much. Any closing comments? I think that was a great spot to end on in terms of the Q&A.
No, thanks. And I wish I could see everyone's faces, and hopefully we can continue to have these conversations in many spaces in public in Winnipeg and Manitoba.
Yes, yes, I certainly think there's a huge interest in tonight because of you and because of the topic. And so we really, really appreciate your time, Bronwyn, and wish you all the best with your growing family there. It's so great to see them on the screen. Lots of people are really happy to see the baby and Sylvia. So yeah, and thanks for sharing us. And I think personally for me, for pushing me, because I have, yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. And so lots of people are interested in the resources that you've shared, and we'll certainly keep those available as well. I should note also that Bronwyn's the co-chair of the Justice stream with the Manitoba Research Alliance with Elizabeth Comack. So this group is doing a whole bunch of work that will be coming out soon. So we look forward to that research agenda. And we're the host here at Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives for the Manitoba Research Alliance. And yeah, I want to thank André Forêt, our very capable tech person here, Wayne Anthony for organizing this series and for the opening remarks, Karen Schlichting, our office manager, for her work on this. And thank you everyone for being here. If you're a supporter, thank you for supporting our work. If you are not a supporter, we need your support to do work like this and to publish social, economic, and environmental justice research. Our research helps show that our best values are possible, and it gives permission for us to hope and shows that we can afford to take better care of each other and address, for example, here the social determinants of health and well-being instead of the downstream negative effects that we've been talking about, the very destructive effects of not taking care of people and taking care of each other. We have been so busy during COVID. It's been quite astonishing, but it really shows the value of our work as Canada's leading progressive research institute. So yeah, again, thank you to our supporters. If you're able to be a supporter, it really does mean a lot, even just a small amount. That makes a huge difference. And we have a charitable tax receipt available. What a darling baby, oh my goodness. Yeah, so that's the end of this series. Hello. And we will be doing another one this fall, so watch for information about that. We'll also send an email in the next day or two with a link to viewing this online that you can share this with your people who aren't able to watch it live on our YouTube channel, and also some links from the chat as well. So thanks so much, everybody, and stay safe out there. Hope you're healthy, and hope to see each other in person soon. Have a good night.